Well, first of all, I hope you don't mind if I sit. I just got hit with jet lag. So if I start falling asleep, just scream. Second of all, this could be such a long talk that you're going to want to go away for the Christmas holidays. So Eva, stop me after a certain amount of time. I've got a stopwatch here, and I'd like to stop to leave some time for questions. Uh, I'm basically a storyteller that got a job as a designer, that realized I wasn't much of a designer, but I could tell stories about design. So that's what I've done for the last 40 or so years. I've written, edited, or co-authored about 182 books on various aspects of design. And what I'm going to do is take you through some of them today. I've also written tons of articles. I've written more material than I have a right to have written. And whenever I'm tired, because I have insomnia, I always read my own stuff, and that puts me right to sleep. This is me on my son's shoulder. I used to do book reviews for the New York Times Book Review as a columnist and wrote the obituaries of dead designers. Dead designers are very nice people because they don't complain about what you write. I grew up in New York City, which is a very wonderful and international place. One of my grandparents was born in Galicia. My great-grandfather was from there as well, although I have no idea where he ended up or what he did. I don't even know my great-grandmother's name. But I do have some roots here, at least from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So that's me learning how to shoot, which everybody in America has to do. I went to a military school. Even though I am a liberal Democrat bordering on the left wing, I wanted to go out and shoot those guns that I learned how to play with. Fortunately, the Vietnam War came along, and I became this. The Vietnam War was a defining moment in the lives of many people, particularly in the 60s in the United States, and it defined what I became as a storyteller and a designer. This is one of my prouder moments. She was the First Lady of the United States, married to the great President Barack Obama. If anybody wants to say anything bad about George Trump, don't worry, I'm not going to go back and tell him. We miss her a lot, and I particularly was proud that she stood next to me on a big box so she could look taller. I started working for underground newspapers. What we called underground was different from what you had here under communist rule and different from what existed during World War II when papers were really underground and fighting for their lives and the lives of their readers. Our underground papers were overground, fighting for the lives of our readers, but in a much different way. And this was the New York Free Press, where we exposed things like the undercover police units that were called the Red Squad that sought out anti-war activists during the 60s. And these are many of them who I later found were actually cops when I was arrested twice and brought to their precinct. Except for the guy in the middle who turned out to be a photographer for the New York Daily News, and he sued us for a lot of money. The New York Free Press was a political paper, as I say, on the left, but we were able to sell most issues when we showed nudity, particularly female nudity. And we got most of our nude pictures from this woman. Does anybody know who she is? Yayoi Kusama. Yayoi, when she was younger, was crazy. And now that she's older, she's crazy too. But she's more famous crazy. And she supplied us with some very weird stuff. I'd have to talk to her every day, which made me a little weird. I was also the art director of what became known as the Sexual Revolution in New York, at any rate, and later part of the rest of the world. And I was the first art director for Screw magazine. I did not do that awful logo. That's why I didn't work there much. I did not design the basis for this logo, although I did refine it. This was designed by Milton Glaser. His idea was the erect E, middle of the E. I didn't like the type he used, which was Helvetica, so I had somebody balloon it up. Shows how much taste I had. I also started my own publication called the New York Review of Sex, which was later called the New York Review of Sex and Politics, and ultimately called the New York Review of Sex and Politics and Aerospace. I was told by our mafia distributors, because anytime you tried to distribute a magazine or a newspaper in New York, you had to go through the Italian or Jewish mafia. I was told I was the only person in New York that could make a sex paper fail. This was the paper. I didn't know much about typography. I had gone to NYU to study English, but they threw me out because I did a comic strip about my philosophy professor, which wasn't very kind. And then to get out of the draft, I also went to the School of Visual Arts, where I now am co-chair of one department and founded 5 other graduate departments. America's a beautiful place. It lets you do a lot of things without having a college education. But I had to teach myself design, and it was the time and the place to do that. You couldn't do that again today. I was also the art director of Rock magazine, which was an early rock and roll intellectual magazine, let's call it, and designed the logo using drafting tools, which you no longer have to do. But all I could make that was really perfect were circles with a compass. So you can see there are a lot of circles in there. I was also designer for Andy Warhol's Interview. New York was an amazing place in the 60s because there was a lot happening in the art scene and the culture scene and the theater scene. Andy had very little to do with this magazine, but it became a very, very famous magazine in the United States. And this was our special Death in Venice issue, which was probably the most depressing thing I worked on to that point. These were some of the layouts I did for Rock, just to show that I did do some typography. It's a little on the crude side, but as I was looking at it, I kind of liked that it had so much energy, that it wasn't based on Swiss design, that it didn't follow a formula, that the person I was most influenced by was a man named Herb Lubalin. And he was the master of overlapping and smash type. And in those days, we set type on something called a typositor, which was not a computer, it was a film machine, and you could expose the letter forms through little strips of film that were on a font, and therefore you could actually overlap these forms inside the camera. I worked for an underground paper called the East Village Other, which was the largest underground in New York, in the United States. In those days, underground papers were about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I didn't do drugs. I had very little opportunity to do sex, and rock and roll I wasn't that fond of either. But I did get to see a lot of great concerts because we had our office over the Fillmore East, which is where every one of the great rock and rollers performed. I won't go into detail about the images. Each image has a story, and I've written about each image in some book or another. I also was art director of the New York Ace, and I was art director for this, Mobster Times, which we did 1 year before the American political scandal called Watergate. And what we were trying to do in this magazine was expose politicians as criminals, which didn't go over well with our printer, who happened to be the Italian mafia, who said, "I'm not going to print a commie red paper." So he put it on press in the middle of the night when only one person was there to watch it. And they would print the pages upside down, right side up, with little ink, with no ink. It was a disaster. From there, I went to the New York Times, a logical progression, from the worst magazine in the world to the best newspaper in the world. And I worked for the op-ed page, buying illustration. I've always been a big fan of illustration. And then I moved over to the book review, which was the first of our publications to go full color. My favorite rock group is the Beatles. Some of you may know of them. And I loved Sgt. Pepper, so any chance I had, I would somehow do a parody of Sgt. Pepper. And in this case, one of my students, who was a terrific illustrator, took my idea to make the Clinton family into Sgt. Pepper and did it so beautifully. It was flawless, matchless. Peter Blake was even amazed. And this was another book review that I did with the cartoonist, comic strip artist Chris Ware. I've always loved comics. I knew about comics long before they were called graphic novels, long before Art Spiegelman, who was an old friend of 40 years, did Mouse, which I have the great honor of saying I told him not to do it because I thought it was a terrible idea. This is Chris Ware, and what he did was he basically redesigned our entire magazine, which in those days you could get through without having to show to anybody. So it got printed, it went out to 2 million people, and then I got called into the office of the design director and told I can never do it again. And I said, no problem, I did it. So rebellion always helps. Another thing I am is an addict. I'm not a drug addict, but I am an addict that takes drugs. I take Bucotan, Zalatan Fact, Designintine, Quivalant, Anxietin, Prozac-A-Type. These are things that will calm my type aspirations, my various ephemera desires, and there's a bad taste inhibitor in there as well. Otherwise, I'd wake up looking like this. These are my addictions. This is an apartment that I rented to store all of my, well, not all of, but a certain number of my collections, from books to 3D objects. You can even see a Polish poster down there. That was an original maquette for some advertisement for paint. This is a little film that shows what that apartment looked like. And it was done by my son, who's a filmmaker of New York City. Odd people in New York City. So I think to be a designer, you have to be in love with things. Uh, Type is a thing. Images are things. You have to find inspiration where you can, and a lot of the histories that I write are based on those things that you saw in that room. In fact, there's nothing that hasn't been written about. That's my excuse for being able to collect them. I collect product mascots and mini mannequins. I collect all sorts of ads and tins and boxes and displays from all over the world. Any kind of ephemera that has type or image on it has affected me in some way, shape, or form. One of the things I started collecting early on were advertising fans. I am fascinated in what magic is used to interest consumers, you and I, to influence us in some way, shape, or form. And fans were used quite a bit, not just in France, although these are French, but throughout the world, and particularly in the United States. That led to an interest in Art Deco, which was the commercial equivalent of modernism. It was dubbed Art Deco because of the French exhibition in 1925, Arts et Décoratif et Moderne. And it kind of filtered its way into all aspects of visual and material culture. It was used as a selling tool for department stores, for haberdashers and the like. This is Altman's, which was a big Manhattan department store. This is cosmetics that were done by a great designer named Gustav Jensen. What I've done in collecting these is I've also uncovered lots of designers who would otherwise go unnoticed and become anonymous. You could even see Art Deco implications in just everyday things like this postcard for a pencil, or for this Kodak camera. It's like a gold and black Mondrian painting. And when enough things are collected and enough stories are written, I usually put a book together. I've done about 12 of them with my wife, Louise Feely, who is one of the best designers I know in the world, and one of the reasons I don't design anymore, because I would just look like a peasant compared to her. So we did a book on Art Deco, a series of books, in fact, 8 books, which culminated in Euro Deco. These are some of the mini mannequins that I've collected. This is a shelf with one that my wife refuses to ever have in the house. So now it's in my office. She just can't deal with the torso. And what I love about these, I call them sculptures of commerce, is that they come out of the surrealist sensibility, which ultimately became surrealism. So while these are post-surrealism as a movement of images, they were done as surreal items before there was a movement of art. And I love the way they also take on personalities, and the way you photograph them can add to those personalities. But many of these mannequins were, in fact, based on real-life people. And I have tons of photographs of the models being sketched in clay. And I like the cuckoo ones as well, like this underwear. Don't ask me why. There's so much out there in the world that is made by designers who never get recognized as designers. And often we don't even see them as design. I think as a culture, European and American and Asian cultures have become much more sophisticated about what is design and what is good and bad design. But I find a lot of the things that were just done by craftspeople to be the purest of designs. So these mini mannequins have a quality to me that are as equal to the Venus de Milo as the Venus de Milo is to these characters. And they were also using craftspeople that went beyond design. I mean, this was done by a seamstress who would make real dresses for real women. These things, by the way, are yay high. They're about no more than 24 inches high. And you look at the quality of the workmanship, and that takes skill. May not have taken education, but it took skill. Here's some more characters. I love the way his head is tilted. And this one, while I don't have the whole figure here, this really is a kind of Venus because there are no arms, and he's silver, is wearing long johns, which I was told to bring to Poland because it was so cold, but it's warmer here than it is New York, so no long johns. Actually, this character has religious implications for me because when I got him, it was in the summer, and it was at my house in the country, which gets very humid. And one day I walked in, and he was dripping from his crotch. So I thought it was the Virgin Mary. And this is the book that came out of it, called Counterculture. Some more of these characters, some more of the room, and that's the end of the confession. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the books that kind of come out of that confession. First of all, are you all graphic designers, or do you represent other design disciplines? How many are graphic designers? How many are UX, UI designers? How many of you think of yourself as just a designer? Okay. Well, any designer, any human being, any sentient being should love type because it is our lingua franca, it's our language, and it speaks to all of us in very different dialects. And not only alphabets, but the styles of type say different things at different times to different people. So I've long collected variations on the Latin alphabet, from the things that are everyday, not even thought about too much from a typographic stylistic point of view, like this piece from a bus line in Albany, New York, to these. So this was done by a Korean student of mine who I was teaching the Latin alphabet to, and he was trying to teach me Korean. I think he got the better end of the deal. But all the material came from a book that my wife and I did called Typology, which was a look at the landscape of typographic expression. I'm doing another one now called Type Speaks, which is along a similar basis, except very specifically what dialects and what accents specific typefaces have. Talking about those styles that have symbolic as well as literal form, I started categorizing type into different styles and forms. And one was shadow or sculptural type, or three-dimensional illusion, as you can see here. And I started collecting all the different kinds of type that either figuratively or literally cast a shadow. And there are many, 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 because at one point we didn't have electricity. We had candlelight. And very often sign painters would put shadows on signs to approximate what would later become shadows from electric on three-dimensional signs. And they were stylistic, but they were also emotional to a certain extent. They were fun. That's something you should never forget about being a designer. You're here to have fun. And you're also supposed to make the people who look at your work, read your work, embrace your work, enjoy what they're doing. We are entertainers of a sort. So that all that material became a book called Shadow Type. We did 4 of these kinds of books. This is another one based on really one of the oldest typographic traditions, and that's the stencil. These stencils are over 100 years old, and they're still usable because they were cut into a very hard oak tag board. And they were used instead, before branding, before corporate identity, these were things that were painted onto burlap sacks or boxes, and they gave the brand of whatever product was being transported in those boxes. So this was, of course, cake flour. 2 colors. You'd get a shadow and you'd get a secondary color. This one was a 1-color piece for tea. And this, while it's not a physical stencil, it represents a genre of type that has found its way through almost all the various eras of type of the late 19th and 20th centuries. Stencil tends to represent industry or mechanics, and so it has a symbolic nature to it. This is, for us, a very famous, well, not famous, but common sign for wet paint. And of course, when you see it, you sit exactly where the sign is and get yourself full of paint. This was actually one of the most profitable inventions in the history of American schools. A woman who was a school teacher in Baltimore created Stenso lettering. And this was how most kids learned lettering, typographic lettering, when they were in 2nd, 3rd, or 4th grade. These were the things that you would copy around and make for your book reports or whatever classroom facilities you had. This is a more sophisticated use of the stencil type by the designer Paul Rand. He was using the stencil to approximate what would be used on bushels of tobacco. So it had a symbolic significance. This was done by Alexei Brodovich. It's stencil, but it's really stylized stencil for a magazine called Portfolio. And this is Paul Rand again using stencil type for a car company that did not quite succeed, perhaps because they used stencil type. And that became this book, Stencil Type. This is Stencil Type by Fernand Léger, the French printmaker and painter, but it has nothing to do with the Stencil Type book. Broom was an avant-garde magazine, and I became very interested in avant-garde magazines because they were the blogs of their day. They were the internet of their moment. They were the things that gave different cultures in different parts of the world, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, even the United States, which was a little behind in the art world, a taste of what was happening that was progressive and unacceptable within the establishment. So this is the Dutch magazine, Wendigen, 125 issues done, each with a different cover, bound with a Japanese style. This is Het Overzicht, which was a Belgian magazine. This was all done as one woodcut. This is Jedermann sein Eisener Fußball by John Hartfield. It was the first political collage or montage ever made for publication. It was a Dada publication. This is Integral, which was a Romanian publication where the designer used typecase materials, metal typecase materials, and set them up in this artful manner. This is from your very own Warsaw, the avant-garde magazine Block. And it became the cover of my book, Maires to Emigre and Beyond. So I have a great fondness for being here, and I hope somebody can turn me on to a couple of copies cheap. This is another magazine. Since I grew up in magazines, and newspapers. I've always had a fondness for them, for writing about them, and for making them. And one of the things that was very and has been very important to graphic design and all design, but specifically graphic and typographic design, and pushing it out into the world, at least the world of designers, are the trade magazines or journals. Das Plakat was one of the most important of the poster magazines that came out of Germany in the 19-teens. It was run by a man named Hans Sachs, who was a dentist. His collection of 20,000 posters was later confiscated by the Nazis, and his family only got them back 2 years ago. And this was some of the work that he would show from around the world, tip-ins and the like. Das Zelt, which means the tent, was a magazine by F.H. Emke, who was a German logo designer. And this is called De Reclame. It's from Holland. De Reclame means advertising in many languages. And every issue of this magazine had a different cover representing a different style by a different artist that would go to printers and designers and try to influence how they would see their work and how their work would fit into the present while representing the future. So here's a little cubism, for example. This Reclame comes from Czechoslovakia in the 1950s, when the Czechs had very little to sell commercially. So the issues are printed on very bad paper, and they mostly sell some minor art supplies and do stories on whatever advertising they did have. But in those days, advertising was not a huge industry in the Czech area. That became a book called 100 Classic Graphic Design Journals that I did with Jason Godfrey. And it's one of my favorite, although it didn't sell very well. Anybody want to buy one? I've done a number of biographies on different designers. I'm not showing them all here, but I am going to show two. This is Paul Rand. Has anybody here heard of Paul Rand? You're laughing. Who is he? Okay, so Paul Rand and I were very close friends, in part because I didn't do the kind of work that he did. In fact, he didn't like the kind of work that I did. But he liked me and I liked him. And
there was something very deep and genuine about the old stuff. You know, I still look admiringly at the collages of Braque and Picasso.
Paul Rand was that art and design are not different. Graphic design may sell a product, but art is a product. And when you put the two together, you've got a 1-2 punch. And it's not about exploiting one over the other. It's about taking values from one and imbuing it in the other, so that a client gets something that they're not bargaining for. They're not just getting somebody screaming, "Buy me." They're getting something that will appeal to an audience, as I said earlier, in an entertaining or even in a thoughtful, introspective way. This is one of his early, most famous works where he borrows from Man Ray's photograms. He was art director for an agency in New York. In those days, most of the ad agencies were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and they ran the big companies that were branded in the United States. And then there were little boutique agencies that had the children of immigrants who came to the US, the same immigrants that Trump is trying to keep out. And Rand belonged to the Weintraub agency, which was a little Jewish agency, and they had the El Producto account. And he would do these ads, one a week, where the ads became personalities. The cigars became characters. But he wasn't just an ad art director. He was a book jacket and cover designer, and did things for paperback books that nobody was doing at the time. Now you see his influence everywhere. And he wasn't just doing those one-offs. He also was the design consultant for major corporations in the United States, like IBM, which is an international corporation. He controlled the entire look of IBM, from redoing the logo, in this case with City Bold by George Trump, no relation to the other asshole. And as you'll see, he designed in such a way that he understood design strategy before it became a common term. You don't see the lines in these IBM logos, which you will see soon. But he recreated in a happy way the products, the interiors of the showrooms, the boxes these things came in, the packaging, and the posters. And then 5 years into his tenure there, he decided the logo needed a more radical redesign. So he added these, what we call scan lines, but the scan lines are not really scan lines. He had no intention of echoing what was going on checks or any other kind of digital, or they weren't even digital devices then, but computer-driven devices. He did it so that he could push back the darkness of the logo and also provide a mnemonic, something that people will always remember. And you always remember this logo because of those lines. And he would always have fun with them, but he wouldn't let anybody at IBM play with them at all. He also did Westinghouse. Westinghouse had a very similar logo, but he refined it. The word refinement is really important in design, because very often you're not starting from scratch. You're starting from somebody else's endpoint, and the endpoint has to be polished, and that polish is refinement. So he would do a logo, he would often brag, in 20 minutes or less, put it in his pocket, sell it, and then go back and spend 6 months refining it. So he would have fun with this logo, which everybody thought was a clown's face, but also looked very much like a schematic, an electrical schematic. You could interpret as much as you want, and he believed that if you're interpreting a logo and using your perspective, then that logo was going to be memorable. So I did a book after he passed away about him, because I had also done his obituary for the Times. And one thing about Paul, he was the consummate designer. He was drawing a logo for the hospital he died in a day before he passed away. And before he passed away, he made sure that his tombstone was already designed by a man named Fred Troller. And in Judaism, when you visit a tombstone or a gravesite, you're supposed to leave a rock to say you've been there. It's kind of like my grandmother saying, you never come and visit. He didn't want any old crappy rock, so he put polished stones at the foot of the tombstone. This is Alvin Lustig. This is somebody I don't think many of you know, but I'm going to ask anyway. Anybody know Alvin Lustig? Find out. He was 45 when he died. So I thought actually doing this book wouldn't take me so long because he was only 45, Paul was 86. I judge things that way, how much time it's going to take me based on the lifespan of the person I'm working on. But Alvin Lustig fooled me because he did so much work. You have to call him a polymath and a Renaissance man. He was mostly known in the beginning for book covers and jackets, where he introduced art ideas, the ideas of abstract expressionism, Mark Rothko, Franz Klein, with graphic design, with hand lettering. So these are a couple of his book jackets that he did for New Directions Press. And he was never satisfied doing one particular style. He did lots of styles because for him, style was irrelevant. It was pushing the media forward. He would have been a perfect designer today. So he did lenticular photographs for some of his book jackets. He used metal type when metal type was being considered passé for this montage. And he did very, very limited, simple, minimalist type, which is always quite beautiful. And this is his widow, who passed away last year, and she herself was a very important designer in the U.S.
To interpret, and the people in the office, Dick wasn't there at that time, but we all, became so familiar with this that he would dictate what he wanted. We don't really know whether he did what he wanted. I mean, we probably worked a little bit of what we wanted, but in the last year and a half, the year before he died, he had really lost his sight. And, but he would, tell us to, go down a pike and over 40 pikers and how hard a pike should be, and how thick the stripe should be, and what the color should be. And then he would use references to pages, like the kind of colors so-and-so would use, or the kind of. But by that time, they were very simple designs.
So what I neglected to say is that Alvin Lustig died at 45 because he had juvenile diabetes. There was no insulin in those days. And so in the last 2 years of his life, he was totally blind, but still designing. He did a lot of things in Hollywood because he lived in Hollywood when he was younger. He was a magician. At 12 years old, he wanted to leave school and devote his life to magic. Instead, he devoted his life to type. He designed Industrial Design magazine. This is a magazine cover that goes in the pantheon of great ones, and this goes at the top of that pantheon. This was Fortune magazine, a newsstand magazine about finance and economy. And he worked for the Black Mountain College under Joseph Albers, teaching design there and later at Yale. He also designed a helicopter. It really works, although I wouldn't go up in it. And it looks very much like a chair he designed. So he took his ideas, his design ideas, and applied them in a variety of ways. He designed this furniture, which also has a certain aerodynamic quality. It allows the room to look very spatial. That's not his photogram, that belongs to Georgi Kepes, but the way the desks were set up gives you a sense of motion. He was also an unlicensed architect. He would work with architects, but he would do the designs of things like the Beverly Landau Hotel in Beverly Hills, California. And that became a book that I did with his widow, Elaine Lustig Cohen. This comes from books and other things I've written about modernism. And I'm going to go through these very quickly, but I'll just say this. When you're a designer, when you start designing, you follow certain rules because that's what you learn, particularly in school. You learn the rules so that you can then break the rules. I didn't have a design education, so I just had prejudices. I didn't like geometry in school, and I didn't like geometry in design. I was not fond of the modernists because I thought they were too rigid and cold, and I preferred expressionistic things and stuff that jumped off the page. So for many, many years, I wrote disparagingly about modernism. And then all of a sudden, I started finding people like Paul Rand, like Alvin Lustig, and others who were doing these amazing things using all the things that I hated. And I thought, well, I'm bigger than that. I'll learn about them. I'll enjoy what they do. And this past year, I did this book with Greg D'Onofrio called The Moderns, Mid-Century American Graphic Design, in which we show how the emigres who came to the United States from Europe during World War II helped change the complexion of design in America, and how the natural-born Americans also followed suit and brought their own personalities to bear. This is Joseph Albers teaching his class at Yale how to turn their heads. This is Joseph Albers' only commercial work done for a very avant-garde record company. This is a man named Irving Harper who worked for Herman Miller Furniture. John Massey, who worked for the Container Corporation. Now, these are all things that use geometry or abstraction, collage or overlaid color, or just primary colors. There weren't many women working in the United States in the 50s, but we found about 7 out of the 63 that we were showing in this book. And this is one of the important ones, Barbara Stuffaker Solomon, who was the first to do super graphics, those large things on the sides of buildings. This is Charles Goslin. This is Ray Komai, a Japanese American. Charles Murphy, who people know very little about, but he was the art director for Command Records. And you can feel the music by looking at these abstractions. This is Ladislav Sutnar, a Czech designer who came to the US in '39 and really became the father of information graphics in the US. And this was one of his identities for ADOX, which was akin to IBM. It was a business machine corporation. It went out of business. It was a Swedish corporation, but its design just lives on in beauty. I mean, look at how he uses the circle as the foremost part of that logo. This is Roy Kuhlman, who did book jackets. Massimo Vignelli, most of you probably know his name, who only used 5 typefaces in his life. Tomoko Miho, another woman who worked in this abstract format. William Golden, he was the chief designer of CBS television and created the CBS Eye, which is one of the more iconic logos in America, maybe the world too. Herbert Matter, who was Swiss, and he came and produced a variety of things, including very famous logo for the Mexico Olympics, which everybody says is psychedelic, but it had nothing to do with drugs. He also did this, which did have something to do with drugs. George Czerny, who is a Hungarian designer, came to the US, and that dancer on the 63 Bulletin is one of my favorite pieces in the whole world. And Paul Rand, of course, who worked with collage. He worked in every manner possible, but he would do it in such a way that it always had this modern spirit, not a contemporary spirit, but a modern spirit. And here's him talking about modernism. Sorry you couldn't see him that well. That leads to a whole other area that I'm involved in as a writer and researcher, and that is symbols, signs and symbols that touch on modernism, touch on anti-modernism, but are mostly about meaning. And one of them is the swastika, which is probably the most significant emblem, significant trademark in the 20th century. I started by being fascinated by the Nazi identity, but then I found, of course, that the swastika belonged to many, many, many other people and had been studied by many scholars going back into the 19th century. Coca-Cola used it, like the Nazis used it. It was on the building facade of the Dakota Corn Palace in South Dakota. That is all made of, all those arabesques are made of corn. Corn gives off gas, methane, and so this one day spontaneously erupted in flame. They rebuilt it without the corn. The Girls Club in America had the swastika, and they had a magazine called The Swastika. And then, of course, there are the neo-Nazis, both in Europe and in the United States, the ones that that other Trump, seems to think have some good guys and bad guys along with them. And the neo-Nazis continue to use the swastika. The swastika is used in strange ways in strange places. This is in Southeast Asia, and it's used in this restaurant called Hitler's Cross. This was used as an anti-swastika for a Don't Smoke campaign, but Adolf Filters, even though it kills you, still has some questionable characteristics. So I did a book called The Swastika, A Symbol Beyond Redemption. I also, from that book, became interested in how dictatorships during the 20th century used graphic design to manipulate the populace, to control thought, and ultimately to sell their ideologies. So I picked Hitler, Mussolini, Mao Zedong, and Lenin and Stalin. They're very much like trade characters, like Mr. Clean, the Cheeto Bandito. I hope you don't have Cheetos here. Speedy Alka-Seltzer, and of course, Ronald McDonald. But the whole point of this exercise is that these characters, these political leaders, these dictatorial beings, created themselves as brands, so that whenever you thought of their country, of their political system, you thought of them. And they created a whole litany of sayings, slogans, and images to back up this mnemonic. So Duce, Duce for Italy. Busts were all over the place in Italy. This one where he looks like a Klingon in Star Trek. Adolf Hitler created his look, which the look itself is a brand. The hairstyle, the mustache. Mao Zedong with his Mao jacket, it may have had function, but it also became a signal and a symbol for his regime. Lenin was actually very proud of not wearing a uniform. He wore a suit that was rumpled. He tried to be connected to an intelligentsia. So he's a different kind of brand, but he was nonetheless a brand. And he was used by artists, particularly some of the avant-garde artists in the Soviet Union at the time, as a symbol of renewal. And then he got himself associated with that guy who liked wearing, oh, shut up. He liked wearing uniforms. Also fascinating is how children were introduced to the ideology. In Italy, there was the young fascists, the Vanguardista, and the characters wore uniforms. They wore berets and fezzes. They wore the Fasci logo. Girls were not allowed to be part of the fascist male organizations, but they had their own organizations where they learned to be mothers and did economics, home economics and the like. And that's what the Piccola Italiana was. In Germany, there was Hitler Youth, and there was the BDM, which was the female version of it, but it was still a male-dominated society. In China, it was the Red Guard, and the Red Guard were basically made up of teenagers and young 20s who were fighting not against the government, but for the reinstatement of Mao Zedong, who had lost his power in the early 60s. And that little red book they hold is the quintessential symbol of that. In the Soviet Union, there were the young pioneers who were indoctrinated early on. Now, this doesn't mean that people in democratic countries don't get indoctrinated either. I certainly was in my own way, and going to a military school was a very easy way to get indoctrinated, but I copped out. Uniforms. The whole idea of uniforms is to proffer uniformity. And in this case, this was an Italian designer named Paolo Goretto, who I became friendly with, who created the Italian fascist uniforms and ultimately became a bodyguard for Mussolini, and realized when Mussolini told him it was a position for life that he didn't want to be there for life, so he snuck out and got away. Even hand gestures and body language are important in branding, today as well as then. So the Hitler salute, which began as the Roman salute, was heralded in many ways and forcibly used instead of a handshake.
Leaflets, pamphlets, books, an avalanche of words and promises. The Germans love the uniform. So Hitler gives out uniforms. Uniforms for everyone. Uniforms for boys, uniforms for girls, for journalists, for motorists, workmen. Whole factories are made over to manufacturing Nazi uniforms. Newspapers are required to spread the doctrine. Nazi cigarettes are introduced with pictures of the leaders on the cars. And the factories where the cigarettes are made belong to the car.
One of the definitions of tyranny is when you see the leader's face on everything. This book, or these materials, became this book called Iron Fists, Branding the 20th Century Totalitarian State. And I don't design my own books. I used to years and years and years ago, but I'm not that good at it, and other people are, and I love seeing how they interpret what I put together. This was done by an American firm called Project Projects. And I told them I didn't want to even look at pages until it was all done. And so I didn't even see it until it was printed in proof form, which was dangerous, but they did a nice job. I did that book also because there's still people who feel this way, and it's growing throughout Europe. I just learned about the Italian election. I spend a lot of time in Italy. This happens to be the uncle of my tech administrator at school. Here we have fascists in Russia, in Greece, in Switzerland. And ultimately, it always comes down to this. So I feel that these books that I do about symbols and where designers play a role in this propagation of ideas is very important. It doesn't lose its significance. Another book that I was working on and actually never finished, although there were some articles out of it, was Racism in Graphic Design. And I always ask my students in New York, what's wrong with this picture? I won't ask you because I'm sure you know. It's that Band-Aid is called skin color. In America, ethnic and racial stereotypes have been used for branding for well over 150 years. Either the image of somebody, like that Indian, is idealized or stereotyped, or the language is comically used, like, you like them in apples. That was always the way we looked at indigenous peoples in the United States, as kind of children who were trying to be like us. Asians were pictured in very bizarre ways. The Chinese as kind of monstrous, with those fangs and those long nails. Or when we were at war with Japan, they were looked at in a bestial sort of way. Jews. There were two waves of Jews in America. The first were the German Jews who were very well off and came to America with money. Then there were the Ashkenazi Jews who came to America. Actually, the first Jews were the Sephardim, but they were kind of invisible because they were down south. But the Ashkenazi Jews were looked down upon by the German Jews. So usually German Jews did caricatures of Ashkenazi Jews using the language, the accent. This is peas knees, which actually means business. And they would make fun of them for being corrupt at business. Blacks were always stereotyped. They were brought in as slaves, and after they were freed, they were still prejudice and violence against them, and much of that hasn't gone away. Little Black Sambo actually started as an East Indian book and was adapted to this character. There were incidental characters like these two bug-eyed African Americans. They had no relationship to the game except they made people smile and laugh. And then there were these two African pygmies who were brought over by Theodore Roosevelt to do the cleaning for us. This was a product that existed even when I was a kid. And this cream of wheat chef, who is a servant. You couldn't rise above servitude in the 50s and 40s. It starts in the 60s where blacks start to become equal in media. But he was a very, what was called a friendly trade character, that a housewife wouldn't mind inviting this character into her house. And of course, it was also an instant breakfast food, which was another issue altogether, how designers pushed the spontaneity of food making and washing and all of the daily chores on women to something that was more pleasurable. The final thing that I'm going to talk about is my own fear of World War III that I grew up with. I grew up in America that was having a Cold War with the Eastern Bloc, with the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons were talked about everywhere. Bomb shelters were set up in all major cities, including my own building in Manhattan. And there was scores of material, visual material, that talked about the coming war and how we will or will not survive it. This was given out at post offices, and it basically said, erroneously, that if you could find a place to hide, you could survive the radiation. We used to have a joke that said, when you see this pamphlet or hear the sirens, put your head between your legs and kiss your ass goodbye. War in the Atomic Age, same thing. There will be a war, but we'll be able to survive it. This was a magazine, a very famous magazine, with an excerpt from a novel called Failsafe, which was a very frightening but beautifully done movie in the 60s of a mistaken bombing of Moscow, which caused a bombing of New York. This was one of the first anti-nuclear satiric drawings ever done by a man named Robert Osborne. This was done after Hiroshima. He worked for the Navy and did how-to manuals for the Navy and just saw this bomb as being the scourge of the planet. And this was done by Ben Shawn for H-bomb tests. Many of the artists in New York and many of the graphic designers worked for the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, which they called SANE. That I'm not going to show you. This became a book called Red Scared, The Commie Menace in Propaganda and Popular Culture. And this particular image was taken from a comic book that, by a Christian ministry that showed what would happen if the communists took over American government. And this, of course, some of you may have seen after 9/11. This was the really great graphic design piece that George Bush had Homeland Security put in every school and every public building. Bad design, it almost makes you want to blow up. This is my favorite movie, Planet of the Apes. Optimism reigns supreme in my house. And I just want to show you a few things that I've worked on over the years that have references to design history. I did this with Seymour Quast. It was a paper promotion called Design and Style. We did it on Streamline. We die-cut papers. I mean, this was the day when paper was really a wonderful tactile material. Art Deco, the Bauhaus, De Stijl, Futurism. We did tip-ins and pull-outs, and Surrealism. All of these covers were interpretations by Seymour Quast, so it was never just a copy and paste. It was always a look and learn. We also did something called the P Chronicles for a printer, where we just played with techniques. And these are just a few of the 182 books that I'm particularly proud of. This one I did with my wife, Louise, their book of my essays. This I did with a French-American design writer, Veronique Vienne, and it's what it says, 100 Ideas That Changed Graphic Design. I did this with Gail Anderson, who I work with at SVA. She's an amazing typographic designer, and it's all about type that you kind of find in the environment that's not really type, but forms type, so, like some of the things up on the wall here. With my co-chair at SVA, Lita Tellerico, we did these 2 typography sketchbook books. Freehand has just come out. And with Gail, again, I did something called Type Tells Tales. This is the British edition. The American cover isn't as nice. And this is about where type is not just the conveyor of information, it is the information, it is the icon, it is the content of the material. A collection of my essays called Rants and Raves. There's more raves in it than rants. And this will come out in the fall. It's the final edition of the book that Seymour Quast and I did called Graphic Style. This one's called From Victorian to Hipster. It started in the first edition in 1983, from Victorian to postmodern. And when I showed this cover to the publisher, I really hated it. But I didn't want to tell Seymour that I hated it. So I showed it to the publisher thinking he'd hate it. He loved it. It's the cover. And just this past year, I did something called Type Deck with Rick Landers, who was a former student of mine, which was supposed to be a game of type, but we lost track of the game, so it just became a kind of history of type styles. I don't think anybody's bought it. And this is the most recent book, which will come out in another month, that I did with Mirko Ilic, with whom I've done about 5 or 6 books. And this is The Nude in Graphic Design. And every year we put on a typography workshop in Rome with my wife, Louise Feely, who designed this poster. And if anybody has time on their hands and $6,000, come. That's it. Thank you. But if anybody has questions, I'm more than eager to answer anything personal about me or anybody else. Oh, come on. Give a guy a break.
I didn't know that of Mirko Ilic about the new poster is already published.
It just came out about 2 days ago, but it's not published. It's just off the boat.
Okay. Right.
Are you in it?
I don't know, because he asked me to send some works, but I don't know what happened to them, if he put them into or not.
You'll soon see.
I have to. But what about the other question is, I was too late to pay for a book of Seymour Quast. I hope incredible book about the war.
Oh, really? You can get a copy.
Published already.
Yeah, it's published both in the limited edition and the trade edition.
Mm-hmm.
But if you write to me, I'll make sure you get a copy.
Thank you.
This is a book that Seymour Quast did. Now I forget the title, even though I put it together.
Once I told him that his left-handed designer is one of my bikes.
Are you left-handed?
I have. No, I'm not. I'm right. That Seymour smiled because he's such a person that knows his face. Wonderful person.
He is. He's 86 years old. He's my best friend, and he formed with Milton Glaser Pushpin Studios in the late 50s and 60s, and the Pushpin changed one of the courses.
Changed everything in the world.
Yeah.
He's speaking about illustration and technology.
And he's still designing, and I wish I get that way when I'm 86. Anybody else? Yes.
I recall a short video with Stefan Zagmeister in it, and speaking very angrily about various designers describing themselves as storytellers. And you opened your lecture telling that you're basically a storyteller, an actual storyteller who got hired as designer. So this is quite interesting to me. How do you see this? How do you see other designers? Because I understood that Stefan saw something like a trend amongst the designers who actually had little to do with writing, but it was a way of maybe creating an image of themselves. What's your take on this tendency?
Well, first thing is, Stefan is a good friend, and he teaches for me in my program. And I've heard him say the same thing. And I say the same thing. But when I first co-founded the program, we said we're doing storytelling that will become products, that every product has a narrative to it. And you take that narrative and you expand it out into the world and see who else is interested in it. And then you develop a product from that. So we use the word storytelling a lot. And Stefan said 2 years later, maybe we should stop saying storytelling. And I started hearing it a lot, and so we stopped saying it. And then about a year ago, I felt, fuck, we are storytellers. And
so it got old and it's cool again.
I'm sorry?
It got old and now it's cool again.
Yeah, it's like if you worry too much about buzzwords, you're going to lose your entire language. And not everybody is a storyteller. And I think that, there are some great storytellers who have nothing to do with the visual arts. But when you use anything as a substitute for other words or other images or other things, that's called jargon. And jargon is laziness. But I know what he's talking about. And the funny thing is he's always telling stories. His shows, he's working on a show now on beauty, but like his show on happiness, that was a long narrative. And his film is, what else can you call it but a story? 3 stories, in fact.
Yes, exactly.
Thanks for asking the question. Oh, come on. I've come so many miles.
There's nothing coming with your subject. How many days are we going to stay in this rainy Warsaw?
How many days are we going to stay in
In the rainy Warsaw.
In rainy Warsaw? Me?
Yes.
I'm leaving Friday morning. No, Friday afternoon. I was telling Eva, this may be my last trip anywhere. Maybe. It's too nerve-wracking going to an airport and having yourself patted down. And when I got global entry. I don't know whether you have it here, but in the US, they vet you for 6 months and then give you a pass so you don't have to stand on line at customs. And I went, and you have to go out to an airport to be interviewed for about 3 minutes after they've vetted you. And I went out, and they looked at me and they said, "Have you ever been arrested and fingerprinted?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "What for?" And I told them what for. He said, "We know. Now I've got to look and see whether you're eligible." And he said, "If you've been arrested within the last 10 years, one misdemeanor, you're ineligible." And my arrests were 40 years ago. So he said, you're fine. Now, will you tell me why you were arrested? And I said, people are standing around. Pornography. And he said, pornography? So it's a drag going to an airport.
You created program for education, and you created a school. Why? Why did you?
Why did I create a?
Yes. Why did you decide to create a school and a program on education for designers and as entrepreneurs?
Well, first, I'll tell you about the program, and then I'll tell you why I did it. Well, no, I did it because I was asked by the head of School of Visual Arts in New York, which is a very reputable school, and even more reputable because they threw me out when I went there. But I created a program called the Designer as Author and Entrepreneur, along with my co-chair, Lita Tellerico, because School of Visual Arts was very good at training designers and artists, photographers and illustrators to go into the marketplace and sell their work. So I wanted something that kind of expanded on that, but had more gravitas. And I thought the next stage of graphic design was not doing more service design, but doing content and being content providers, another buzzword. So we started with the program where every student has to create a business that they actually take out into the marketplace. And we've had some success. Now we call the thesis, which is the business, a venture. So we're much more about creating businesses and how design and business come together to work in a sustainable and value-driven way, as opposed to just exploitative. And the old term for when I was a teenager was sellout. And so you couldn't use the B word, business, with graphic design or any art that you were doing. And when we started the program, you couldn't use the E word, the entrepreneur word, because it didn't sound academic enough. But all of that's changed, and now a lot of schools are doing the same thing. But I started it because when asked to do something that I seem to think I might be able to do well, I say yes. When asked to do something I know I'll do badly, I say no. And it turned out that when I left the New York Times, it was a good thing I said yes, because I had a parachute and something to do during the days. And in fact, I've got a great deal at the School of Visual Arts. I don't have to do a damn thing. I can just sit in my office and write all day. But I co-chair and I talk to students and push things. And I started other programs, the interaction design, product design, branding design, design criticism, social documentary film.
You're speaking about School of Visual Arts, which was sometimes a brilliant school. How is that?
How is it now?
Yeah, the level of the school.
The level of the school is still very high. It's still very high. I'm very proud of our students. We added these graduate departments, and that raised a certain level of the school. But the demographics of the school have changed radically. I was telling somebody today that we only have 20% Americans in the school. And that changes the culture of the school, not for anything bad, but it changes the way we teach, it changes what we teach, it changes how we teach, it changes what they come away with. And that's what change is all about. You know, I knew that when I started there 30 years ago, it wouldn't be the same place, or I would even be there 30 years later. But the one thing I would say about American schools in general is that people who come need to be able to speak English, and they need to be able to speak a kind of vernacular English, or it's very hard to communicate. I mean, I'm grateful to all of you for listening to my broken New York English. Well, I could never learn your language, and I went to French class for 10 years, and they just snort at me when I'm in Paris.
You have a sticker on your laptop. What is it about, and what do you think about these scenes that basically modifies final product?
Well, the sticker is called Know Your City, but it's grammatically incorrect. It was one of the many production companies that my son put together. He's 29. He's been a filmmaker since he was in high school. And what he loves to do, as an aside from his commercial work, which he likes also, is he likes to capture New York City characters and places and things. So he's done series on drag queens called Queens of Kings. Queens of Kings. Kings County is Brooklyn. And he's done this film about all these drag queens and makes them very human and very wonderful. He's done New York's Got Talent, which takes street performers that people of my generation would pass on the street, cross the street to get around, and shows how talented or how wonderfully crazy they are. And so I'm promoting him. But also, I had to put a phone number down one time, and I used a Sharpie, and a Sharpie you can't wipe off. And so there's somebody's phone number here. I don't know who it is. And this was the only thing I had to cover it. And what was the second question?
What do you think about things that basically modify the final product?
Things that modify the final product. I think intervention is great if there's something to intervene against. I mean, all political protest is intervention. I think if you're defacing something that has history to it, then shouldn't do it. It's wrong. But modifying things, it's a situational ethic, not a general conclusion.
Okay, I've got some questions. First of all, I would like to ask you about your writing. And I mean, do you have any routines while you are writing? Then, what do you do in case of creative block? In case you, I mean, if you do experience such blocks still. And the second question would consider literature. You, in one of interviews, you told that you are reading for pleasure and information. And I would like to ask you about this first class of books.
The pleasure?
For pleasure, yes. Do you have your favorite European author, and who is it?
Well,
who would you like to read?
This past year, because of the political situation in the U.S., Arthur Koestler became my favorite author. He started in Europe and ended up either in England or America. But he's so depressing that I feel great. Darkness at Noon is an amazing book, and I call it Shithole of the World, but it's something else, when he was in the French concentration camps. My pleasure comes from reading this very strange author named Philip Kerr, who does detective stories about a detective in Nazi Germany who is not a Nazi but gets sucked into all these Nazi things. And there's enough history that I know that it's pleasurable to read the history, but he also makes it into a mystery story. So I've always liked Agatha Christie, so it's kind of like a combination of all my little passions. And it stops me from watching television, which is a good thing. The writing part. I do have a routine. I write every day, except these days I don't write on the weekends. I usually go into the office. It used to be I'd go in at 5 a.m. Now I go in between 7:30 and 8, and I'll write for a few hours then. And if I've gotten something going, I'll continue to write through the day. I was up late last night after we had dinner because I wanted to write about my trip to Auschwitz. So I was able to do that, and then I woke up early and finished it and sent it in. I don't have blocks, because if I have a block, I just don't do the thing that I'm supposed to do. I do something else. So there are literally 7 books that I haven't finished out of the 182. Probably will never finish. And it's not because of a block, it's just I lost interest. And because I've done so many others in that same period of time, I don't feel guilty. I feel guilty when I don't have an idea. When I was a kid, the one thing I wanted for Christmas was an idea. The idea of having an idea was just so appealing to me. You know, when you see people who make movies or make art or make books or anything creative, they have ideas, or inventors. I mean, Steve Jobs, he had an idea, and that just is such a wonderful thing to have. And you don't have to be any race, creed, or color to have ideas. You just have to have the wherewithal to put them out into the world. So as long as I have an idea, I'm content. And when I don't have ideas, then I start doodling around in my brain for ideas. But they're there. You just pull them out of the air. And they may not be good ideas. I've got plenty of those. But they seem good at the time. Yes?
Thank you. Do you have any advice for us, hopefully future designers, how to get well known and good at what we are doing?
My advice is usually bad. I mean, I feel that there are so many things that, whether you're a designer or not, you should do to just build yourself. Reading is one of them. Staying on top of the news is another one. Having ideas is another one. But designers today, I think, have a remarkable opportunity to mix media, which I didn't have when I was starting. I would have loved to have made films, and I just couldn't. I didn't have the wherewithal, I didn't have the connection, and I was also so in love with sticking pieces of type and picture on pages that I didn't think I needed to. And so I live vicariously off my son, for example. But I think the biggest and probably the wisest advice is to do as much media as possible, not get stuck in a social media vacuum, not get stuck thinking there is a right or a wrong way to do it. just do it, and then let other people critique it, and you accept the critique that, or not. And that's one thing students tend to forget. They can be critiqued, but the critiquer could be wrong. And usually there's something that comes out of a good critique. But I always tell students, particularly my master's students, don't take everything I say as gospel, because it ain't. One more?
Can you tell us something about your first book?
My very first book? Well, there was a first book that never got published, that first book published that took 2.5 years to get sold. It was a very simple concept. It was called Artist's Christmas Cards. I'm a Jewish kid who likes Christmas. And I like presents. I like Christmas carols, and it's all very kitschy stuff. But I started collecting Christmas cards that illustrators would send me. And then from there, I started researching artists who did Christmas cards. I even found the Christmas card that Albert Einstein made for someone. It wasn't that good, but he tried. So I put a bunch of them together, a lot of famous artists, a lot of less famous artists. And people liked the book, but they just didn't want to invest in it. And finally they did, and I was very excited. And I got the New York Times Magazine to put it on the cover. But unfortunately, it was a year before the book came out, so it did absolutely no good for the publicity. But that was my first book, and then it was sold into paperback. And you know, I can't look at it now because I designed it, and I did such a terrible job designing it. But it is, there's still fondness for it. Well, thank you all very much.
One more.
One more? Okay.
My question is, what do you think about graphic design nowadays? Does we provide something new? Does our generation provide something new to graphic design, or we're just copying what was done already?
It's a good question. You know, you could ask the same about music. You can ask the same about art. And there's always something that rises to the top that's new. And very often, like there was a really wonderful David Hockney show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And it took us through his evolution. And you could see where he was influenced by so-and-so and such and such. And you can then see who was influenced by him. And I think that graphic designers still can do really amazing, exciting things. There's a poster show you guys probably know about, the Golden Bee in Russia, Moscow. The guy who puts it on came to visit me a few weeks ago and brought me one of the catalogs, and I was just floored by how amazing the work was from all over the world. And they were posters, so they may not have addressed, some of them addressed real problems and some of them were self-made problems, but there was still such creative energy coming out of them. And many of them were for issues. And I think if you can stimulate people's minds on an issue basis, you know, like women's rights or whatever, that's a real gift. And even with multimedia the way it is, a poster or a flyer or a logo or something still has power to make you think or make you remember or whatever. So I think graphic design is in a better place than ever. And I'm not saying that because I want some of you to come to our Italian program for $6,000. Okay, thank you.